Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here, and today is a very sad day because I'm bringing you the very last in the run-throughs for the stimulus material for F585 paper, because as you know, this is the final time that this particular specification will be assessed. So for most people, I imagine this video will probably be appropriate if you are completing a resit in this particular unit. So in the next series of videos, what I'd like to do is I shall talk you through each of the extracts, go into a little bit of the theory, show you how it links into the specification, and then obviously probably the most important thing for all of you is to try and have a little attempt to predict what the likely questions will be. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's today get to it and have a look at the introduction to this particular extract. So do bear in mind that really the whole purpose of this stimulus really is to get you thinking about various aspects of economic theory and to make sure that your knowledge is just tip-top on those particular areas. If you know your theory, you ought to be able to apply that to any given scenario. So whatever question comes up in the paper, the exam paper, you should be able to deal with that with great dexterity. So I'm just going to read this through, ladies and gentlemen, stop at one or two points and just pick out a few key terms which we will look at in more detail in the videos which follow this particular introduction. So, the start of 2016 saw the global economy in a state of flux. Some of the economies that had seen rapid growth for many years in the new millennium were in the process of slowdown. For example, China. Some were even suffering from recession, such as Brazil and Russia. So you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the term the BRIC nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, and here we have a few of them mentioned here already. Note this term recession, make sure that you know what it means. So it's 2 successive quarters of negative growth. Carrying on. On the other hand, others, including India, also one of the BRIC nations obviously, continued along a rapid growth path. And we see this morning, ladies and gentlemen, in the news, Tata, the Indian conglomerate, just announcing a new chief executive in place. In the developed northern hemisphere, it was an equally checkered picture, with the likes of the USA and in particular the UK showing signs of slow but nevertheless consistent growth, averaging around 2.5% annually. And of course for the UK that would be around trend. While others such as Germany, France and Italy struggle to achieve an average of 1%. However, ladies and gentlemen, when we're thinking about Germany, let's not forget in the last week or two they have announced the largest current account surplus, so value of exports greater than value of imports, the largest in history. So things can't be that bad in Germany. Japan, another leading G7, so the group of 7 leading nations, of course, which the UK is part of, although how long that will last is another matter, was barely able to average 0.5%. Okay, so the key theme here is obviously economic growth. And as we move into particularly into extract 1, we will see that this whole notion of short-term versus long-term growth becomes more of a focus. Paragraph 2. While the short-term picture in the UK was rosier than most, the signs were that the recovery being experienced was more a case of short-run increased capacity usage rather than long-run growth. So here we have, ladies and gentlemen, our first inkling at what's to come. The focus here being the differentiation between short-run growth and long-run growth. And I'm sure that you're all very familiar with that anyway, but just for a quick recap, if we have a PPF curve, y and x, PPF 1, and we're operating here at point A, well within the frontier. Lots of unemployed resources. If we move to point B here, that is economic growth, but that is short-run economic growth because you're simply using up the potential which is in your economy. You're not increasing the potential, you're just using up the resources which are there. If you move from A to C on the line, again, that is short-run growth. You're simply growing your output, not shifting the potential, making it bigger. If, however, the PPF moves outwards to here, that means you can produce more of everything, so your potential maximum output has gone up, then that, as you know, is long-run growth. So if we went from A to D, for example, that's long run. Now you can illustrate the same thing, of course, using long-run aggregate supply curves, the traditional Keynesian aggregate supply curve. So A, for example, there would be down here somewhere. Very significant unemployed resources at that point. If, however, you experience growth of output, you might move to B. So B might be around here somewhere. So you move into from Y1 to Y2. C is on the line, so that's your maximum potential. Where is our maximum potential here? Well, it's on this vertical section of the KAS, so C might be there, AD3. And then where might we increase our long-run potential? It's if the KAS curve is shifting to the right. So we can use these PPFs, which are more your micro diagrams, and your macro ADAS diagrams to illustrate this whole notion of economic growth. Very important concept, as I'm sure you know. So let's get back to it. The lack of inflationary pressure present in the economy, despite employment numbers being at an all-time high, was indicative of such. Now again, ladies and gentlemen, that's a crucial bit of our economic theory, isn't it? So we have always been used to P dot inflation, unemployment here, and remember your Phillips curve theory, PC, the notion being that if you reduce the level of unemployment, you're able to do so, but you have to accept higher rates of inflation. And those of you who are doing the new spec, of course, do a lot of work on this. So if you want to get from point A to point B and reduce the level of unemployment in this direction, it's possible to do so, but traditional theory would suggest you've got to accept higher inflation. As a consequence, there is a trade-off. And we see that also in our Keynesian aggregate supply curve, our KAS, AD1 to AD2, yet again increasing employment, so reducing unemployment obviously, but again we are trading that off against a higher price level. P would be rising up to P2 in this instance. So this whole notion of trading off inflation against unemployment, very important concept as we move into this extract and stimulus in more detail. Despite employment, with the Chancellor still firmly focused on deficit reduction. Now, by deficit reduction here, ladies and gentlemen, what we mean and what is meant is the fiscal deficit. So you will know, I'm sure, that that is the relationship between G, government spending, and T, tax revenue. G being the injections into the economy, T being the withdrawals from the economy. And for years and years and years now, as I'm sure you know, but particularly in recent years, last 10 years or so, the fiscal deficit, the extent to which G has been significantly greater than T, particularly up to around about 2009-10, it was just getting out of hand, the hundreds of billions of pounds. So the coalition government of David Cameron, of course, one of its main objectives was to try and bring that down and under control again. So fiscal deficit when G is greater than T. And I've got some more stuff to share with you on that in later videos. But if you were to, for example, have a look at a very good website called publicspending.co.uk, and it's got all sorts of different things on it, but here you can see we've got information on the, if I can just bring that up, here we've got information on the fiscal deficit. So you can see, as I was saying, 2010, well over 100 billion. And the general trend, although it hasn't been always reducing, the general trend is that that deficit is reducing. Now, why is that important? It's important because every time we have a deficit, this rolls onto our national debt, and our national debt gets bigger and bigger. And all sorts of really interesting charts on this website, like this one, for example, showing periods of deficit and periods of surplus and so on. And we'll come back to that, as I say, later. So that's the fiscal deficit. It was difficult to see where necessary investment funds would materialise. Obviously, if the government's trying to cut back on its expenditure, then that makes the whole notion of, well, let's spend this money on new roads, new railways, new infrastructure, all that type of thing, that becomes more and more difficult, more and more pressing. And as you can see here, infrastructure projects, so necessary for facilitating long-run capacity growth. So these infrastructure projects necessary for this type of work, ladies and gentlemen, shifting PPF outwards and shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left, to the right, sorry. Okay, moving on. The globalized economy. Now obviously this is a hint at even the section of the specification we should be looking at. Globalization section. Was far more interdependent than in the past. Uncertainty with large and established markets impacted greatly on the economies of emerging and developing economies. One policy option for nations heavily dependent on the sales of basic commodities, so oil, copper, these types of things, was to allow their currencies to depreciate on the forex, the foreign exchange markets. This could potentially provide a boost to exports. Okay, another quite important aspect then, which you'll need to know for your exam, I'm sure, is this whole notion of currency depreciation. So if we take a demand and supply curve for a currency, let's say it's sterling, and we've got the price of sterling, quantity of sterling. Very interesting on the new specification that the board are insisting that these are labelled as such. Not entirely sure I agree with that, but nonetheless we've got to keep the examiners happy. Anyway, depreciation. You'll remember your AD equation. C to the I to the G to the X minus M. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Which part of this AD equation is going to be impacted predominantly by a depreciation in the currency? Obviously it is the net exports section. How would a country engineer, if you will, a depreciation of its currency? Well, it could, for example, lower its base rate. People would then sell off the currency. The supply of the currency into the forex would increase. And so we would be moving from E1 down to E2, representing a depreciation of the currency. And the golden rule, ladies and gentlemen, I say this so often, yet people forget it. I don't know why, but they do. The price of exports always move in the same direction as the currency. The currency depreciates, the price of your exports will fall. Now, all other things remaining equal, ceteris paribus, that's ceteris paribus, the demand for exports should go up. And the flip side of the same coin, price of imports should rise, ceteris paribus, demand for imports should fall. And so that helps to boost AD because exports are an injection and they're going up. Imports are a withdrawal and they're falling, so there's a double net gain there, if you will. So clearly an important aspect of analysis, I'm sure, in the exam in the summer. Alternatively, where appropriate, the removal of import barriers was seen as a potential option to solve domestic problems. It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? So import barriers, we're talking about tariff diagrams. So I'll not get into this in too much detail here. Suffice to say, you could do this in two ways. So we could do this would be the sort of GCSE standard diagram. So import barriers such as a tariff, for example. Tariff is a tax, as you know. S plus tax. So the price, whenever you include the tariff, the price goes up. Therefore, the hope is that people stop buying the imported good, perhaps switch to buying your own domestically produced goods. And that, of course, is known as expenditure switching, an expenditure switching policy. The other diagram, which you'll be familiar with at A2, I'm sure, is where you have the domestic supply, the domestic demand, and you are then rattling through with world prices with a tariff, and showing how import levels change from here to here. And then you've got these areas which are important and so on. But we'll get into that whenever we get into the extracts for real. But again, that's another important aspect of analysis, I'm sure, for you for the summer. For despite the very considerable gains made in that country in terms of greater equality and development, greater equality could be obviously something to do with income distribution, could be Gini coefficient, Lorenz curve type analysis. And then we have this key word here, stagflation, a stagnant economy with inflation. So what's a stagnant economy? Is one which is just not moving at all. So unemployment is growing and inflation is growing, stagflation. Next paragraph. Another policy option to less developed nations is to join the increasing bid to attract FDI, foreign direct investment. So you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with this whole notion of FDI coming into an economy such as we have Nissan, for example, in the northeast, Watashi Unamai Nissan, the most efficient car plant in the whole of Europe on our doorstep, brought here in the 1980s, and of course a great boost and a great benefit for maybe 30 to 40,000 jobs in the local northeast economy. So there are all types of benefits to this FDI, but also as well all sorts of disadvantages too, and particularly when we're talking about companies who invest in the developing world, where they have no loyalty. They are searching for the countries which are the most lax in terms of regulations. Therefore the company experiences the least costs. Therefore the company maximizes its profits, and they really have no loyalty to that company. So if they see a better profit-making opportunity elsewhere, they will shut the factory and move all their logistics elsewhere. So of course there are pros and cons to all of this. And we've got this whole notion of development zones which have been on pre-release materials and stimulus materials in the past. Okay, as a means of, we've had this in the UK anyway, with the establishment of enterprise parks and zones and that type of thing. And then finally, Friday 25th of March saw the Rolling Stones play a free concert in Havana to an audience of 500,000 locals. The first of its kind in Cuba, hot on the heels of President Obama's visit to the island. The first by US president in 90 years. Both events are seen as significant signs of the opening up of one of the world's last remaining command economies. Now this is interesting because in the past we've never really had any questions on market versus planned stroke command economies and the advantages, disadvantages, pros, cons of each. Whether or not it will actually be on this one, obviously you need to focus on the specification and what you need to learn, but it's an interesting that's even actually mentioned. A major step in its transition, so these economies moving from planned to market economies, these are called transition economies, of which there are many. For if you think of Eastern European economies, which are still to this day opening up and welcoming free trade and all this type of thing. Both events are seen as significant steps in the opening of one of the world's last remaining command economies, A major hurdle will be to try and overcome a lack of business confidence among foreign companies dipping their toes into, historically, such an overtly communist economy, talking about Cuba, obviously. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Quite a nice stimulus material, I think, this year. And the essay, as I'm sure you all know, will be probably focused on the very last stimulus, very last extract. So that's it really, that's all I want to say on this, and in the next series of videos what I'd like to do is to just talk you through the other extracts, link them to the spec, and most importantly for you, let's have a go at predicting what the likely questions will be for the final time on this particular exam series. So that's it, and stay tuned for upcoming videos with regard to these extracts. Bye for now.